get started. Sherlock Holmes and the Labyrinth of Time. Chapter 1. The Strange Visitor. It was on one of those bleak, drizzling evenings in late November that I found myself once again ensconced in the cosy warmth of 221B Baker Street. The rain pattered persistently against the windows, and the gaslight outside cast flickering shadows upon the curtains. Holmes, seated in his customary armchair, was poring over a monograph on ancient ciphers, his sharp features illuminated by the firelight. A fragrant plume of smoke curled lazily from his pipe, giving the room an air of contemplative serenity. I had just set down the latest edition of the Times when Mrs. Hudson entered, announcing that a visitor had arrived. Her expression betrayed a hint of curiosity mixed with unease, as though the stranger's appearance had unsettled her. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said, without looking up. "It seems our evening is to take a more diverting turn." The man who entered was peculiar indeed. He was of middling height, with a gaunt frame, wrapped in a damp overcoat. His face was pale and drawn, his thinning hair plastered to his skull. Most striking of all was his intense, darting gaze, which flitted about the room as though searching for invisible threats. Under his arm he clutched a leather satchel, the contents of which seemed to weigh heavily upon him. "Pray, take a seat, Mr. Carrick," Holmes said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. The man started at hearing his name, his lips parting in surprise. How did you know my name?" he stammered. Holmes permitted himself a slight smile. "The faint trace of oil on your fingertip suggests your profession as a clockmaker, and your satchel bears the mark of Carrick's Fine Timepieces, a well-regarded establishment on Fleet Street. It was hardly a leap of deduction." The visitor sank into the chair, his hands trembling as he unfastened the satchel. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse and wavering, "I am a man of simple means, but I have come to you out of desperation. My life, sir, is in grave peril." Holmes leaned forward, his piercing grey eyes fixed upon the man. "Proceed, Mr. Carrick. Spare no detail." Carrick drew a sheaf of papers from his satchel and laid them on the table. They were letters, written in a spidery, uneven hand, their contents terse and ominous. "These," he said, "are the reason for my distress. They began arriving a fortnight ago, delivered by unknown hands. Each one demands that I complete a project for a certain patron, an individual whose identity remains unknown to me. Failure to comply, they say, will result in consequences too terrible to imagine." Holmes took up the letters, examining them with a meticulous eye. "Interesting," he murmured. "The penmanship suggests a deliberate attempt to disguise the writer's natural hand, and the paper bears the watermark of a rather exclusive stationer in Mayfair. But tell me, Mr. Carrick, what is this project of which they speak?" Carrick hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. I am a clockmaker, as you have surmised, and a patron commissioned me to craft a unique timepiece several months ago. It was an intricate design, unlike anything I have ever encountered. At first, I thought it merely a novelty, but as I worked, I realized it was more than a clock. The mechanisms, complex, almost labyrinthine, seemed to serve some purpose beyond the measurement of time. "And you have not completed this device?" Holmes inquired. "No, sir," Carrick replied, his voice trembling. "The instructions ceased abruptly and I set the project aside, but now these letters—" He faltered, his hands clutching the arms of his chair. "They demand its completion, yet I fear what it may bring." Holmes sat back, steepling his fingers. "Your instincts are not unfounded, Mr. Carrick. There is more to this than idle threats. You mentioned no knowledge of your patron's identity. Was there truly no clue, a name, a voice, anything?" "Only a single letter signed with the initial M," Carrick said. "The payment was generous, delivered in advance through an intermediary. Holmes nodded. Then we must begin there. The intermediary may yet yield valuable information. For now, Mr. Carrick, I advise caution. Do not engage further with this project and inform me immediately should any new letters arrive. Carrick rose, his shoulders still hunched under the weight of his anxiety. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I place my trust in your hands. As the door closed behind him, Holmes turned to me, his expression alight with intrigue. Well, Watson, he said, what do you make of our visitor? He strikes me as a man terrified for his life, and not without cause, I replied. Those letters suggest a sinister intent. Indeed, Holmes said, reaching for his violin. There is a game afoot, my dear Watson, and it promises to be most engrossing. A clockmaker, an anonymous patron, and a mysterious device. What could be more enticing? We shall begin with a visit to Fleet Street in the morning. As the strains of Holmes's violin filled the room, I could not help but feel a growing sense of unease. The case had only just begun, yet already it seemed to carry the weight of something far beyond the ordinary. Chapter 2. The Missing Apprentice. The morning air was brisk as we stepped into the world outside 221B Baker Street, bound for Mr. Reuben Carrick's workshop. The events of the previous evening had left Holmes in an unusually contemplative mood, and his silence as we made our way through the crowded streets was marked by a furrowed brow and the rhythmic tapping of his walking stick. When we reached Carrick's fine timepieces on Fleet Street, it was Holmes who rapped sharply at the door. Mr. Carrick himself answered, his face pale and drawn. He ushered us into his workshop, which was a cluttered yet oddly meticulous space, filled with the scent of oil and brass. The walls were lined with shelves bearing an array of intricate clock parts, gears, springs, and hands of every conceivable size. My apprentice, Timothy, Carrick began, wringing his hands as he spoke. He hasn't been seen for 3 days. I didn't think it was connected at first, but with the letters and the blood. His voice trailed off as he gestured toward the floor near the workbench. Holmes knelt, his keen eyes narrowing as he examined the dark stain on the wooden planks. He produced his magnifying glass and studied it in silence for a moment before speaking. It is indeed blood, though faint. It appears to have been hastily wiped, which suggests a struggle. Carrick looked as though he might faint. I fear something terrible has happened, Mr. Holmes. Holmes rose and scanned the room, his gaze settling on the half-assembled clock on the workbench. This, he said, gesturing toward the device, is the object at the heart of this mystery, is it not? Carrick nodded, his hands trembling. Yes, sir. It is the very project the letters demanded I complete. But, Timothy, he only assisted with the assembly. He knew little of its purpose. He knew little of its purpose. Holmes leaned over the clock, his long fingers deftly tracing the intricate symbols etched onto its brass face. Watson, he said, his voice low, observe these markings. They are no mere embellishments, they are ciphers, their meaning obscured but deliberate. I examined the symbols but could make no sense of them. What do you deduce, Holmes? They suggest an intent far removed from the measurement of time, Holmes replied. This device was designed for a purpose unknown to us, but one that undoubtedly holds great significance to its creator or creators. Turning back to Carrick, Holmes asked, "Where is Timothy's lodging?" Carrick fumbled with a scrap of paper and handed it to Holmes. "He rents a room in a boarding house near Fetter Lane." Holmes nodded and handed the paper to me. "Watson, we shall investigate. Mr. Carrick, I advise you to remain vigilant. Lock this workshop when you leave and speak to no one of our inquiries." Timothy Layton's lodgings were as unremarkable as the man himself had appeared in Carrick's description. a small, dimly lit room in a nondescript boarding house. The landlady, a stout woman with a suspicious gaze, led us up a creaking staircase and into the room. "Timothy's a quiet lad," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "Never caused trouble, always paid his rent on time. But he's been gone for 3 days now, and it's not like him." Holmes thanked her and began his examination of the room with his usual precision. The bed was neatly made, the desk orderly, and the room bore no signs of a struggle. Yet Holmes's sharp eyes soon alighted on a small, dark stain near the window. "Blood," he murmured, crouching to inspect it more closely. The landlady gasped, clutching the doorframe. "Oh, heavens, what's happened to the boy?" "That," Holmes said, rising, "is what we intend to discover. Has anyone visited Mr. Layton recently?" "No, sir. He mostly kept to himself." Holmes nodded thoughtfully and moved to the desk, where he opened a small drawer. Inside he found a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn from use. Flipping through its pages, he paused and handed it to me. "Watson, take note of this." The notebook was filled with sketches of mechanisms and calculations, interspersed with strange symbols similar to those on the clock. Beneath one particularly intricate sketch were the words, "The key lies within." "Fascinating," Holmes said, his gaze distant. "It seems young Layton may have uncovered something significant." As he closed the notebook, his eyes fell upon a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath it. Opening it, he revealed an address scrawled in an elegant hand. "Alderney Hall, Surrey." Holmes's expression sharpened. "It appears our next destination is clear. Watson, let us not delay." Chapter 3. The Enigma of Alderney Hall. The journey to Alderney Hall took us deep into the Surrey countryside, where the rolling hills and skeletal trees seemed cloaked in an air of foreboding. Holmes had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout our train ride and subsequent cab journey, his keen mind no doubt piecing together the fragments of the case. I refrained from disturbing his reverie, though my own thoughts were alive with questions about the mysterious Lady Estelle Darlington and her connection to the perplexing clock. As we approached the hall, its grandeur struck me immediately. The sprawling manor, with its ivy-clad walls and turrets, bore the unmistakable mark of wealth and history. Yet there was something about it, a shadow of neglect perhaps, that lent the place an eerie quality. The windows, though clean, seemed darkened, and the long gravel driveway was flanked by overgrown hedges that looked as though they had not been trimmed in years. We were met at the door by a tall, gaunt man whose expressionless face and unsettlingly silent demeanor gave me an immediate sense of unease. He did not speak, but gestured for us to follow him into the manor. The interior was no less imposing, with high ceilings, richly adorned walls, and an air of cold detachment. The butler, if that was indeed his role, led us to a drawing-room where Lady Estelle Darlington awaited. She was a striking woman, her age difficult to determine, with silver-streaked auburn hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess us with a mix of curiosity and caution. She rose gracefully as we entered, her movements as deliberate as her gaze. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying a note of guarded formality. "I understand you wish to speak with me regarding a matter of some importance." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, Lady Estelle, we are investigating a series of events that appear to be connected to a commission you placed with a clockmaker, Mr. Reuben Carrick." Her expression did not change, but I noticed a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, in her eyes. "Ah, yes, the timepiece," she said, seating herself and motioning for us to do the same. "Mr. Carrick's work is exquisite, and I had requested something rather unique. However, I was under the impression the matter was concluded months ago. What could possibly have prompted your visit?" Holmes studied her intently, his fingertips pressed together. "It seems Mr. Carrick has received threatening letters concerning the completion of this project. Letters written in an anonymous hand, but with a tone of urgency and menace. It raises the question, Lady Estelle, of what purpose this clock was intended to serve." Her composure remained intact, but there was a faint tightening at the corners of her mouth. "I am afraid I can offer little insight, Mr. Holmes. The clock was to be a centerpiece for my collection, a work of art, nothing more. If Mr. Carrick is facing threats, I assure you I have no knowledge of them." "And yet," Holmes said, leaning forward slightly, "the nature of the device suggests a purpose beyond the ornamental. The symbols on its face, the complexity of its mechanisms, they hint at something far more esoteric." Lady Estelle's gaze grew colder, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "You tread dangerously close to impertinence, Mr. Holmes. I have told you all I know. If there is nothing further, I would ask that you take your leave." Holmes did not appear fazed by her rebuke. "One more question, Lady Estelle. Might we inspect the grounds? There are certain peculiarities about this case that may benefit from a broader investigation." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as though weighing her options. At last she nodded. "As you wish. My staff will accompany you. Do not wander where you are not invited." With that, she rose and swept from the room, her movements as regal as her demeanor. The mute butler reappeared, his silent presence as unsettling as before, and gestured for us to follow. As we passed through the grand corridors of Alderney Hall, I became increasingly aware of the oppressive atmosphere. There was an odd stillness about the place, as though it were holding its breath. In one corridor, we encountered a maid who appeared to be dusting a sideboard. She was young with an unremarkable appearance, but her manner was peculiar. She seemed overly attentive to our movements, her eyes flitting to Holmes with an expression that suggested both curiosity and wariness. Holmes, ever observant, gave her a brief nod and continued walking. Once we were out of earshot, he murmured to me, "Note the maid's behavior, Watson. She is far more interested in our presence than her duties require." "Do you suspect her of some involvement?" I asked. "Not directly, but she may hold a piece of the puzzle," he replied. We were eventually led to a small study overlooking the rear grounds of the manor. Here Holmes paused, his gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a hawk surveying its prey. The desk bore an array of papers, and among them Holmes's sharp eye caught a folded letter. He moved to it swiftly, glancing over its contents. "Curious," he muttered. "A correspondence with an individual identified only as M. The language is cryptic, but suggests a transaction of considerable consequence." Before I could inquire further, the butler's presence at the doorway reminded us that we were being watched. Holmes returned the letter to its place and nodded curtly. "Come, Watson, our investigation has only just begun." As we left Alderney Hall, I could not shake the feeling that the manor's secrets were far darker than Lady Estelle had let on. The peculiarities of her household, the mute butler, the attentive maid, and the enigmatic lady herself hinted at hidden depths yet to be uncovered. Holmes, I could see, was already several steps ahead, his brilliant mind working tirelessly to unravel the threads of this labyrinthine mystery. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Workshop. The journey back to Carrick's workshop under the shroud of night was fraught with an unspoken tension. The streets of London, usually alive with the bustle of activity, were eerily quiet save for the occasional rumble of a carriage or the distant bark of a dog. Holmes had been silent since our departure from Alderney Hall, his sharp features betraying the focused intensity of his thoughts. The workshop, when we arrived, stood dark and foreboding against the cold glow of the street lamps. Mr. Carrick had heeded Holmes's earlier advice to lock the premises, but a faint glimmer of light flickering through the curtains told us we were not alone. Holmes raised a hand, signalling for me to remain silent, and approached the door with his usual feline grace. Producing a set of tools from his coat pocket, he worked the lock swiftly and silently, and within moments we were inside. The faint glow we had seen came from a small oil lamp burning on the workbench. The smell of recently extinguished candles lingered in the air. The room was in disarray. Papers lay scattered on the floor, and drawers hung open, their contents rifled through. Holmes moved with practiced precision, his gaze sweeping over the scene as he took in every detail. "It appears we are not the only ones interested in Mr. Carrick's project," he murmured, his voice barely audible. We approached the workbench, where the half-assembled clock still rested. It was untouched, its intricate mechanisms gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Holmes picked up a stray piece of paper from the floor and studied it intently. "This," he said, handing it to me, "is a rough sketch of the clock's inner mechanisms. Note the peculiar arrangement of these components." I examined the sketch, but the complexity of the design was beyond my understanding. "What do you deduce, Holmes?" "These are not the workings of a mere timepiece," he said, his tone grim. "This device was constructed with a secondary purpose in mind, one that its creator took great pains to obscure." Before I could respond, Holmes's attention was drawn to Carrick's desk. He moved swiftly to it and began examining the surface, his fingers brushing over the wood with deliberate care. Suddenly he paused, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "A hidden compartment," he said softly. Producing his pocket knife, he worked at a nearly invisible seam along the desk's edge. With a quiet click, a concealed drawer slid open, revealing a bundle of papers tied with a piece of twine. Holmes extracted them and spread them across the desk. "These," he said, his eyes gleaming, "are the true plans for the clock." The diagrams were far more detailed than the sketches we had seen before, and among them was a single sheet bearing a cryptic message. "The past is the key to the present. Unlock it, and time shall obey." "What on earth does it mean?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "It suggests," Holmes replied, his voice low, "that this clock is not merely a mechanism to measure time, but an instrument designed to influence it." I stared at him, struggling to grasp the implications of his words. "You mean to say this device could—" "Not in the literal sense, Watson," Holmes interrupted, though his tone carried an edge of uncertainty. "But it is clear that its creator intended it for a purpose that goes beyond the mechanical, whether that purpose is scientific, symbolic, or something more sinister, we cannot yet say." As Holmes continued to examine the plans, a noise from the rear of the workshop startled us both, a faint creak of a floorboard, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. "Someone's here," I whispered, reaching for the revolver I had concealed in my coat. Holmes motioned for silence and extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. We waited in tense silence, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped altogether. In the faint moonlight streaming through the window, I saw Holmes move toward the source of the noise with cat-like stealth. A sudden crash shattered the silence as something toppled in the adjoining room, and Holmes sprang into action, flinging open the door to reveal a figure scrambling toward the back entrance. "Stop!" Holmes commanded, his voice cutting through the darkness like a whip. The intruder hesitated for a split second before bolting. Holmes gave chase, and I followed, my revolver clutched tightly in my hand. The pursuit led us through the narrow alley behind the workshop, the cobblestones slick with moisture. The figure was quick and agile, but Holmes was quicker, and with a well-timed lunge, he brought the man crashing to the ground. "Watson, the light!" he called, and I struck a match, revealing the face of our would-be burglar. He was a wiry man of indeterminate age, his clothes ragged and his face gaunt. His eyes darted wildly between Holmes and me, and I saw the unmistakable glint of fear in them. "Who sent you?" Holmes demanded, his grip unyielding. The man remained silent, his lips pressed tightly together. Holmes's expression hardened. "I advise you to speak now or face the consequences." Still the man said nothing, but his eyes betrayed him as they flickered toward the bundle of papers Holmes had retrieved from the hidden compartment. "Ah," Holmes said softly. "You were after the plans. Tell me, who hired you?" The man opened his mouth as if to speak, but before he could utter a word, a sharp crack echoed through the alley. He convulsed violently and collapsed, lifeless, to the ground. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed, dropping to my knees to examine him. A small dart protruded from his neck, its tip glistening with a viscous liquid. "A professional silencing," Holmes said grimly, his gaze sweeping the surrounding rooftops. "Whoever orchestrated this has resources at their disposal and is willing to go to great lengths to protect their secrets." We returned to the workshop in silence, our minds heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Holmes carefully gathered the plans and concealed them within his coat. "This has become far more dangerous than I anticipated," he said, as we locked the door behind us. "We must tread carefully, Watson. The forces at play here are not to be underestimated." As we made our way back to Baker Street, I could not shake the feeling that the mystery of Carrick's clock was only the beginning of something far more sinister, a labyrinth of secrets and shadows that would test even Holmes's formidable intellect to its limits. Chapter 5. The Secret of the Clock. The morning dawned grey and subdued, the kind of day that seemed to encourage reflection. Holmes, however, was far from introspective. Seated in his armchair, his penetrating gaze fixed on the detailed diagram spread across the table, he appeared as focused as a predator stalking its prey. I, on the other hand, struggled to make sense of the labyrinthine mechanisms depicted in the clock's blueprints. "It's not simply a clock, Watson," Holmes murmured at last, breaking the silence. "The design is too intricate, too deliberate. These mechanisms here and here suggest a purpose far beyond timekeeping." I leaned forward, studying the points he indicated. "What sort of purpose, Holmes?" He tapped one of the diagrams, his expression grim. "This device is designed to conceal a hidden compartment, a cavity within the clock, small but secure. Whatever it was intended to hold must be of significant value or danger." I stared at the diagram, the implications of his words sinking in. "You believe it was meant to transport something?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The compartment is ingeniously concealed, accessible only when the clock's hands are set to a specific sequence, a code, if you will. It's a feat of engineering, and one that suggests the involvement of a mind both brilliant and devious." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Carrick himself, his face pale and his hands trembling. He looked as though he had aged years since our last meeting. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice shaky. "I've come to tell you everything. I can no longer bear the weight of this secret." Holmes motioned for him to sit. "Begin at the start, Mr. Carrick. Spare no detail." Carrick sank into the chair, wringing his hands as he spoke. "Several months ago a man approached me, a representative of a wealthy patron. He offered me a sum of money that was substantial, far beyond what my humble workshop would usually earn. The task was to create a unique clock one that adhered to precise specifications. At first, I thought it a mere novelty, a challenge for my craft, but as I worked, I began to realize it was something more. "What do you mean by more?" Holmes asked sharply. "The designs?" Carrick hesitated. "They included symbols I did not understand and mechanisms that served no obvious purpose. When I questioned the man, he became evasive, even hostile. He implied there would be consequences if I failed to complete the project." "Did he identify himself or his employer?" Holmes pressed. Carrick shook his head. "No, only that his employer was a person of great influence. The instructions came in stages, delivered anonymously, and always accompanied by veiled threats. I became increasingly uneasy, but I had already accepted the commission." "And the apprentice, Timothy Layton?" I asked. Carrick's face darkened. "Timothy was a bright lad, but I fear he may have known too much. He was helping me assemble the clock when he began asking questions I could not answer. A week later, he disappeared." Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "Mr. Carrick, do you still have the clock in your possession?" "Yes, it's in my workshop," Carrick said. "I stopped working on it after Timothy vanished. I feared completing it might bring about something terrible." That evening, Holmes and I accompanied Carrick back to his workshop. The dim light of the single oil lamp cast long shadows across the cluttered room, and the unfinished clock sat on the workbench, its brass components gleaming dully. Holmes examined the device with meticulous care, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings on its face. "The symbols," he murmured, "align with those on the plans. And here, the keyhole to the hidden compartment." He produced a small set of tools and began working at the mechanism. After a few tense moments, there was a soft click, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a shallow cavity within. Inside was a single, folded sheet of parchment, its edges brittle with age. Holmes extracted it carefully and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the faded writing. "It appears to be a cipher," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "A riddle meant to conceal something of great importance." "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes read aloud. "The past's treasure lies in the shadow of time. Seek where the hands point, and the path will align." Before we could speculate further, a crash from the front of the workshop shattered the silence. The sound of splintering wood and hurried footsteps followed, and Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "Stay here, Watson," he barked, darting toward the commotion. Ignoring his command, I followed, revolver in hand. We found Carrick sprawled on the floor, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. Two figures were silhouetted against the broken doorframe, their faces obscured by scarves. "Stop!" I shouted, raising my weapon. The intruders hesitated for a moment before one of them lunged toward the workbench. Holmes intercepted him with a well-placed blow, sending the man sprawling. The second figure grabbed the clock and bolted, and I gave chase. The pursuit led us into the narrow alley behind the workshop, the thief's dark figure illuminated briefly by the flickering light of a gas lamp. He was quick, but my military training served me well, and I managed to tackle him to the ground. "Holmes!" I called as I wrestled with the man. Holmes arrived moments later, binding the man's hands with a length of rope he had retrieved from the workshop. The other intruder had escaped, but we had at least managed to recover the clock. Back in the workshop, Carrick winced as I bandaged his arm. "They were after the clock," he said, through gritted teeth. "They knew its value." Holmes was already examining the parchment again, his expression a mixture of intrigue and determination. "This cipher, Watson," he said, "is the key to everything. The clock, the threats, Timothy's disappearance. It all revolves around what this riddle conceals." I looked at the battered door. I looked at the battered door and the shattered glass scattered across the floor. The attack had escalated the urgency of our investigation, and I could not help but feel that we were now entangled in something far larger and more dangerous than we had anticipated. As we prepared to return to Baker Street, Holmes turned to me, his eyes alight with purpose. "We are not merely chasing a missing apprentice or a peculiar clock, Watson. We are unraveling a conspiracy, one that could have far-reaching consequences if left unchecked." I nodded, bracing myself for the trials ahead. For the first time I understood the gravity of our task. The clock was not simply a device, it was a key, and we were about to discover what it would unlock. Chapter 6. The Silent Key. It was late the following morning when Holmes sat at the desk in our sitting room, surrounded by papers and sketches taken from the workshop. The riddle hidden within the clock's compartment occupied his full attention. He had been uncharacteristically silent, save for the occasional murmur as he scribbled notes or consulted one of his many reference volumes. I observed him from my chair, marveling at his ability to sift through layers of obfuscation with a precision that seemed almost otherworldly. Finally, he straightened, his eyes alight with discovery. "Watson," he said, holding up a sheet of paper covered in his neat, angular handwriting, "the riddle's solution lies in the alignment of symbols on the clock face with the positions of the hands. It was not designed to measure time, but to point to a location, a specific place within Alderney Hall." "Alderney Hall?" I asked, surprised. "You believe Lady Estelle is hiding something of significance there?" "Not hiding, Watson, seeking," Holmes replied, his tone sharp. "The safe we are about to uncover will reveal her true motives. Prepare yourself. We leave for Surrey immediately." The journey to Alderney Hall was brisk and uneventful. Upon our arrival, the oppressive air of the manor seemed more palpable than ever, as though the walls themselves held secrets they dared not reveal. Lady Estelle received us in the drawing-room, her demeanour cool and composed, though I detected a flicker of unease in her piercing gaze. "Mr. Holmes," she said smoothly, "to what do I owe the honour of your return?" Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries. "Lady Estelle, the clock commissioned from Mr. Carrick was no ordinary timepiece. Its purpose was to conceal a riddle, which I have now deciphered. That riddle leads to a hidden safe within this very house." Her expression froze, and for a moment the mask of composure slipped. I don't know what you mean." "Come now," Holmes said, his voice cutting through her denial like a blade. "The time for pretense is over. The safe exists, and I suspect its contents will explain why you involved Mr. Carrick in this affair." Lady Estelle's shoulders sagged, and she sank into a nearby chair. "Very well," she said, her voice tinged with resignation. "Follow me." She led us through the dimly lit corridors of Alderney Hall to a small library tucked away at the rear of the house. The room was lined with shelves of dusty volumes, their spines faded with age. Lady Estelle moved to one of the bookshelves and pressed a concealed latch. With a soft click, the shelf slid aside, revealing a heavy iron safe embedded in the wall. "This," she said, "is what you seek." Holmes stepped forward and examined the safe with interest. Its design was intricate, the lock bearing a pattern of symbols identical to those on the clock. Producing the plans from his coat pocket, he worked quickly, aligning the symbols in the prescribed sequence. The lock released with a metallic groan, and Holmes swung the safe door open. Inside, we found a leather-bound portfolio and a collection of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. Holmes carefully withdrew the portfolio and opened it on a nearby table. Its contents were astonishing: an ancient map, its edges yellowed with age, depicting a series of landmarks and pathways marked with cryptic annotations. "What is this?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes from the map. Lady Estelle sighed, her voice heavy with emotion. It is a map of my family's estate, dating back centuries. It marks the locations of hidden treasures buried during a time of war to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The letters, written in cipher, contain the clues needed to locate the treasure. Holmes picked up the bundle of letters and examined them briefly before turning his gaze to Lady Estelle. "And you commissioned the clock to decode the letters?" "Yes," she admitted. "I was desperate to recover what was lost. My family's fortune was squandered over generations, and Alderney Hall is all that remains. The clock was to be the key to unlocking the cipher, but I lacked the resources to complete it myself. That is why I sought Mr. Carrick's expertise. Yet you failed to consider the consequences of your actions," Holmes said sharply. "Your involvement with shadowy intermediaries has placed you in grave danger, Lady Estelle. These letters and this map are of value to more than just your family." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Holmes held up one of the letters. "This cipher was not created by your ancestors alone. Its complexity suggests the involvement of a more recent hand, someone who has manipulated you from the start." As Holmes spoke, the door to the library creaked open, and the mute butler entered, his expressionless face as inscrutable as ever. He moved to Lady Estelle's side, his presence unnerving in its silence. Holmes turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "You are not merely a servant, are you?" The butler made no reply, but his posture stiffened. "Your loyalty lies not with Lady Estelle, but with the one who seeks to exploit her," Holmes continued. "You have been their silent observer, ensuring their plans proceed without interference." The butler's hand moved toward his coat pocket, but Holmes acted swiftly, stepping forward and disarming him with a precise motion. A small pistol clattered to the floor, and the butler glared at Holmes with a fury that confirmed his guilt. Lady Estelle gasped. "What is the meaning of this? Who are you, truly?" "He is an agent," Holmes said, his voice cold. "An operative, sent by the individual who orchestrated this entire scheme. Your patron, Lady Estelle, was not merely interested in recovering your family's fortune. They sought the treasure for themselves, and you were their unwitting accomplice." The butler remained silent, his defiance unbroken, but the truth was clear. With the butler restrained, Holmes turned his attention back to the letters. "These must be decoded," he said, and swiftly. "The longer they remain a mystery, the greater the danger." Lady Estelle, shaken but determined, nodded. "Do what you must, Mr. Holmes. I only ask that you protect what little remains of my family's legacy." "We will do our utmost," Holmes replied. "But know this, Lady Estelle, the shadows surrounding this case are deep and treacherous. We have uncovered only a fragment of the labyrinth, and the path ahead will not be easily traversed." As we departed Alderney Hall, the weight of the discovery hung heavily in the air. The map, the cipher, and the hidden safe had revealed a tangled web of greed and manipulation, but the identity of the true architect of this scheme remained elusive. Holmes, ever undeterred, strode forward with his usual confidence. "The game, Watson," he said, "is afoot, and it is one of the most dangerous we have ever played." Chapter 7. The Puppet Master. The morning at 2:21, B. Baker Street began with Holmes seated at his desk, his pipe emitting a thin stream of smoke as he scrutinized a collection of letters sent to Reuben Carrick. His grey eyes, sharp as a hawk's, darted between the notes and a magnifying glass in his hand. The light from the window illuminated the papers, revealing faint impressions and details invisible to the untrained eye. "Watson," he said abruptly, "we are dealing with a man who fancies himself clever, but whose ego betrays him." "How so?" I asked, setting down my teacup. "These letters, sent to Carrick, bear a deliberate attempt at anonymity," Holmes explained. "The handwriting has been altered, the vocabulary intentionally plain, but there is one detail their author could not hide, the faint initials embedded in the wax seals. Holmes handed me one of the envelopes and pointed to the residue of a broken seal. It was faint, nearly imperceptible, but under the magnifying glass I saw it clearly. S.V. Silas Vane, Holmes said with a grim satisfaction. And who is Silas Vane? I asked, unfamiliar with the name. A clockmaker of considerable skill and ambition, Holmes replied. He was once a rival to Carrick, but his practices were less than honourable. He vanished from public life after being accused of fraud. To the outside world he was a man undone by his own misdeeds. But I suspect Vane has merely taken his craft underground, using his talents for schemes such as this. Holmes gestured to the letters and designs on the table. These plans bear his unmistakable touch, mechanisms that rely on misdirection and concealment. His involvement in this affair is not just likely, it is certain. The task before us now was to locate Vane. Holmes, with his characteristic efficiency, delved into records and personal contacts. By midday, he had identified Vane's whereabouts, a small, inconspicuous workshop in Limehouse, a district known for its labyrinthine alleys and harbouring of dubious characters. "We must move quickly, Watson," Holmes said. "Vane will not remain in one place for long, not now that his plans are unravelling." The fog of Limehouse was a blanket of grey, muffling sounds and casting ghostly shapes on the cobblestones. Vane's workshop was tucked away in a decrepit building, its windows darkened. Holmes observed it from a distance, his gaze methodically scanning for signs of activity. "Note the faint light in the upper window," he murmured. "Someone is inside, likely Vane himself." He motioned for me to follow, and we approached the side entrance. Producing his lock-picking tools, Holmes worked swiftly, and within moments the door creaked open. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered with the detritus of Vane's trade. Half-assembled clocks, loose gears, and tools lay strewn across workbenches. But it was the papers scattered across the main table that drew Holmes's attention. He moved to them at once, his movements precise and silent. "These are instructions," he said, scanning the documents. "Vane has been coordinating the entire operation from here." He picked up one of the letters and examined it closely. The same handwriting as the threat sent to Carrick. And here, in the margins, notes on Timothy Layton's activities. Vane has been tracking him. Holmes's voice grew sharper. He intended to silence the boy before he could reveal too much. Our search was interrupted by the sound of a door opening at the rear of the workshop. Holmes signaled for me to remain still as he moved toward the noise. Peering around the corner, he caught sight of a man whose wiry frame and angular face matched the description he had given of Silas Vane. Vane, unaware of our presence, moved to a safe embedded in the wall. He worked quickly, extracting a bundle of papers and a small, ornate box. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Silas Vane," he said, "your schemes have come to an end." Vane froze, his hand hovering over the safe. Slowly he turned, his sharp eyes narrowing as they met Holmes's. "Well, well," Vane said, his tone laced with mockery. "The great Sherlock Holmes, I wondered when you might catch up." "You've left a trail of evidence that even a novice could follow," Holmes replied coolly. "Your letters, your designs, and your very initials have betrayed you." Vane smirked. "You think you've outwitted me, but you've only scratched the surface of my plans. You may have reached me, Mr. Holmes, but capturing me is another matter entirely." Before Holmes could respond, Vane hurled the contents of the small box onto the ground. A thick cloud of smoke erupted, filling the room and obscuring everything. "Watson, the door!" Holmes shouted, but the smoke was blinding. and the sound of Vane's retreating footsteps was already fading. Holmes moved swiftly toward the rear exit, but when we emerged into the alley, Vane was gone, the fog of Limehouse swallowing him whole. As Holmes and I scoured Vane's workshop, a faint, muffled sound reached my ears. It was subtle, almost imperceptible beneath the ticking of unfinished clocks, but unmistakably human. "Holmes," I whispered urgently, "did you hear that?" He raised a hand for silence, his sharp ears attuned to the sound. It came again, a faint groan, emanating from a storage cabinet tucked into the far corner of the room. Holmes moved swiftly, wrenching the cabinet door open to reveal a sight that made my blood run cold. Inside, bound hand and foot, lay Timothy Layton. His face was pale, his clothes disheveled, but his eyes gleamed with recognition as they met ours. "Watson, untie him," Holmes ordered, his voice low but firm. I hurried to comply, cutting through the ropes that held the young apprentice captive. He stumbled forward, leaning heavily on me as he regained his footing. "Mr. Holmes," Timothy gasped, his voice hoarse, "you've got to stop him. I'm Vane. He's planning to raid Alderney Hall tonight. He knows where the treasure is." Holmes's expression hardened. "How long has he kept you here?" "Days," Timothy croaked. "He kept me alive because he needed the final details of the clock's mechanism, but once he had them—" Holmes nodded grimly. "You're safe now, Layton, but there's no time to lose. Vane has no intention of stopping until he gets what he wants." As we prepared to leave, Timothy's revelation added urgency to our pursuit. Vane's plan was no longer a theory, it was a ticking clock, and time was running out. Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced the room, his frustration evident. "Vane is no ordinary criminal," he said. "His cunning and resourcefulness rival even my own. He has eluded us for now, but his escape is temporary." "And the papers he took?" "Is temporary." "And the papers he took?" I asked. "Crucial to his next move," Holmes replied. "But his actions have exposed him. Vane's network will unravel, and when it does, he will have nowhere left to hide." Holmes's eyes burned with determination as he returned to his desk. "The game is not over, Watson. Vane's flight has only postponed the inevitable. We shall confront him again, and when we do, the final stroke will be ours." The chase had only just begun, and though Vane had slipped through our grasp, I knew that Holmes's relentless pursuit of justice would not waver. The labyrinth we found ourselves in was darker and more perilous than ever, but the end was drawing near. Chapter 8. The Final Stroke. The carriage wheels churned through the muddy roads as we made our way back to Alderney Hall, the air heavy with anticipation. Holmes sat across from me, his hawk-like eyes fixed on the dim horizon, where the outline of the manor was beginning to take shape. The map, cipher, and clues recovered from Vane's lair had pointed unmistakably to this place as the final stage of his grand scheme. "Vane will return to Alderney Hall," Holmes said, breaking the tense silence. "It is where the treasure lies, and he will not abandon it, even after his narrow escape. He believes himself untouchable, but tonight we shall prove him wrong." "And Lady Estelle?" I asked. "She remains unwittingly complicit in Vane's plans," Holmes replied. "But I suspect she has grown suspicious of his motives. Her cooperation will be key to springing the trap." Alderney Hall loomed before us, shrouded in the dim light of dusk. Lady Estelle greeted us in the drawing-room, her expression a mix of apprehension and indignation. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "you've returned unannounced. What is the meaning of this?" "Lady Estelle," Holmes replied, his tone measured. "Silas Vane is the man behind the threats to Mr. Carrick, the disappearance of Timothy Layton, and the plot to exploit your family's legacy. He will come here tonight, seeking the treasure hidden beneath this house. I require your assistance to stop him." Her face paled. You mean to say I have been deceived? Indeed, Holmes said. But you can make amends by aiding us now. Ensure the staff are kept away from the library and that no one interferes with our work. Reluctantly, she agreed, and Holmes and I set about preparing for the confrontation. The trap was laid in the library, where the secret safe had been exposed. The clock, retrieved from Carrick's workshop, was placed on the table as bait, its concealed compartment holding a decoy map. Holmes had anticipated Vane's arrival and had positioned us strategically. I was to watch from a concealed alcove near the door, while Holmes stationed himself behind a shelf of books with a clear view of the room. We did not have to wait long. A soft creak echoed through the hall as the library door opened. Silas Vane stepped inside, his movements deliberate and calculated. He wore a dark overcoat, his angular face illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows. Vane's eyes immediately fell on the clock, and a glint of triumph flashed across his features. He moved toward it, his hands deftly manipulating the mechanism to access the hidden compartment. It was then that Holmes emerged from his hiding place. "Your game is over, Mr. Vane," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Vane froze for a moment, then slowly turned to face us. "Holmes," he said, a smirk playing on his lips, "I should have expected you, but you're too late. The treasure is already mine." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You underestimate me, Vane. This is no treasure map but a decoy. The real map remains safely in my possession." Vane's smirk faltered, but his confidence quickly returned. "Ah, you're clever, Holmes, but you've made one fatal mistake. You've cornered me with no means of escape." At that moment, the door burst open, and 4 of Vane's men entered the room, their presence as menacing as the weapons they carried. "Watson!" Holmes shouted, but before I could react, 2 of the men seized me, their grips ironclad. "You're outnumbered, Holmes," Vane sneered, "and this time there's no Lestrade to save you." What Vane had not accounted for was Holmes's mastery of misdirection. With a sudden motion, Holmes hurled a book toward the chandelier, shattering the light and plunging the room into darkness. "Watson, get down," he shouted, and I complied, twisting free from my captors in the confusion. The room erupted into chaos. Holmes moved like a shadow, his precise strikes incapacitating one of the men while I struggled with another. Amid the commotion, Vane slipped away, fleeing through the door and into the grounds beyond. Holmes pursued Vane into the dark woods surrounding Alderney Hall. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting ghostly shadows that danced with the motion of their chase. Vane, though wiry and swift, could not match Holmes's unrelenting determination. The sound of snapping twigs and labored breaths filled the air as Holmes closed the distance between them. Vane, realizing he was losing ground, turned and drew a knife, his face a mask of desperation. "This ends here, Holmes," he snarled. Holmes regarded him coolly, his own weapon a sturdy walking stick raised in defense. "Indeed, Vane, but not in the way you expect." The confrontation was brief, but decisive. Vane lunged, his movements erratic, but Holmes sidestepped with the grace of a fencer, delivering a swift blow that disarmed him. Vane crumpled to the ground, defeated but alive. Back at Alderney Hall, the sound of a whistle pierced the night air. Inspector Lestrade and his men had arrived, their timely intervention ensuring the capture of Vane's gang. I, bruised but unharmed, greeted Holmes with a relieved smile. "Lestrade, you're late," Holmes said, though his tone carried a hint of gratitude. "I see you've managed without me," Lestrade replied, his eyes falling on the subdued Vane. "This one will have a lot to answer for." The treasure, once decoded, proved to be a collection of gold artifacts and rare documents hidden in a long-forgotten chamber beneath Alderney Hall. Lady Estelle, though shaken by the events, was grateful to Holmes for preventing Vane from exploiting her family's legacy. As we departed the manor, I turned to Holmes. "You've done it again, Holmes. Justice has prevailed." Holmes's expression was contemplative as he lit his pipe. "Justice, Watson, is often a matter of persistence. This case has shown us the lengths to which some will go to satisfy their greed. But it has also reminded me of the dangers inherent in our work. The shadows we chase are never far from consuming us." As the carriage rolled away from Alderney Hall, I could not help but feel a sense of closure. Yet I knew that for Holmes the game would never truly end. There would always be another case, another puzzle to solve, and another shadow waiting to be illuminated by his unparalleled brilliance. The end. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the story, please subscribe to the channel. Your unwavering support keeps me motivated.